This is the Yázì cutting Jian made by LK Chen, and it is an excellent reproduction of an existing antique from the Qing dynasty. Now, we can tell that this sword was made at the famous Long Quan forge based off of the scabbard fittings, the maker's mark, and it really hosts some very unique design elements, from the guard as well as the pommel and the tip itself, which is quite angular. Let's take a closer look. First and foremost, I want to talk about Long Quan, a city in China that has been the home to sword makers and forges for centuries. More recently, Long Quan has become well known throughout the sword world as it produces many different types of blades from many different types of cultures. So from kitchen knives to katanas, from rapiers to Jian, Long Quan makes it all. So why is this sword touting the Long Quan name? Well, it goes back into Chinese history and the history of the city itself, which had prominence for being a very important place for sword makers and sword forging. The name Long Quan actually translates to dragon well or dragon spring, and it was named thus because of several naturally occurring springs in the area which are essential to the forging process. More importantly, swords made at Long Quan back in the Qing dynasty received a very particular style of fittings, similar to like a maker's mark. So you would get the words Long Quan as well as a dragon put onto scabbard fittings as well as on the sword itself. Another signature element that you find on Qing dynasty swords is the Yázì, a mythical creature that represents murderous intent or bloodlust. In its depictions, it has the head of a dragon, the body of a wolf, and is fond of murder. Yázì is not only found on swords, but is a common motif on all types of weaponry, including polearms and axe heads. Back in the Ming dynasty, Yatzu was listed as one of 9 sons of the dragon, which became less about dragons and became more of a style guide for decorations. The other children of the dragon are zoomorphic creatures representing certain moods and attached to particular design elements, like turtles that rest under pillars, lion head door knockers, fish on roof ridges, and taotie, which had already appeared on bronze vessels and on sword guards much further back in history. Now, it's not just the guard, but in fact the pommel that also has a head with an open mouth devouring the handle. And when we look closely, we can see that this is not a mythical creature, but in fact a fierce, raging tiger. When we look closely, we can see the similarities of the teeth, eyes, and stripes on the forehead of a tiger. This tiger motif shows up a few times in Qing-era swords and is thought to be the maker's mark from a very specific sword maker. Looking to the other end of the sword, one of the design elements I would like to point out on this sword is the very angular tip. Although it is not unheard of, it is definitely not as common nowadays as the rounded edges to the point of the sword. The triangular tip began back in the Ming dynasty and continued on through the Qing dynasty. It truly makes a statement, and it really helps this sword stand out. This is a cutting sword from the Qing dynasty, but what does that actually mean? Well, when we compare it to another popular Jian design from the Qing dynasty, we can immediately see a huge difference in blade length, which indicates that this sword was used for more long-range fencing and thrusting purposes, while the shorter sword had an emphasis on cutting power. We can also see that the Yázì sword has a much wider blade, with the edges almost parallel from the guard to the tip of the sword, whereas the other sword has much more tabor from the guard to the tip. The wider, more robust blade of the Yázì sword would reinforce cutting techniques when striking harder targets. Lastly is the shape and the size of the handle. So while they do both have the lozenge shape that we typically see with Qing dynasty Jian, the thickness of the handle is quite different. We can see with the Yázì sword, you have a lot more thickness here, so when you grab, you have a much more substantial grip, whereas the Long Jian has a much thinner grip that would allow the hand to do more articulations for some more intricate techniques. This does not mean that one sword is superior to the other and that one is only made for thrusting while the other is made for cutting and vice versa. In fact, the Yázì sword is very effective for piercing and thrusting techniques and is quite mobile, as well as the Long Quan has very good mass distribution for cutting power. It's just clear that certain aspects of usage were emphasized in the design. Let's now take a closer look at the Yázì Jian. The sword is just over 3 feet long with a blade length of 29.5 inches and made of a high carbon manganese spring steel. The blade has a diamond-shaped cross-section and some good distal taper, which makes for a very sturdy sword, yet allows flexibility towards the tip, which has that very striking angular shape. The Raging Tiger pommel, the Yázì guard, and the signature Long Quan scabbard fittings are all cast in brass, which complement the beautiful reddish hue of the rosewood handle and scabbard. Not only is this sword historically accurate, but it has a very beautiful set of fittings, including the very unique Fierce Raging Tiger pommel. It is also an excellent crossover sword for martial artists that want a functional sword for forms training, as well as a historically accurate sword that is similar to the ones that their past masters would be using. I mean, this is the type of Jian most traditional Chinese martial arts were built upon, so it is no surprise that it works so well in Jian Fa and Jian Shu, especially when compared to the average length of modern Jian. It is nearly identical to what practitioners are using today. It is also quite similar in weight, but more importantly in the balance of the sword when compared to a modern Jian, which make for a very familiar feeling when holding this sword, even if for the first time. Let's not forget that this sword is called a cutting sword. So how does it fare in cutting action? Surprisingly well. At this point, I have only used this Jian to cut through water bottles. However, at the release of this sword, LK Chen put a video out of himself actually cutting through tatami rolls to show this sword's cutting prowess. I'd like to conclude this video by saying that I am extremely impressed with LK Chen in the making of this sword. It is a functional sword, it is a practitioner's sword, and it stands up for more than just simply forms training. This is historically accurate, it has excellent mass distribution, it has excellent handling, and it is an all-around beautiful sword. It is by no means extravagant in design, yet very refined and elegantly bears the name of the Longquan forge, the famous forge of China's sword history. If you'd like to know more about this sword or pick one up for yourself, I'll leave a link to the site listing in the description down below. Otherwise, if you already have this sword and you want to share your input on it, I'd love to hear it, so drop that down in the comments. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.